Everyone knows the fashion industry sells perfection. But what happens when one of its biggest stars decides perfection isn't worth the price? Mohr seemed to have everything. Global campaigns, luxury runways, magazine covers, and the kind of career most aspiring models only dream about. Then, almost as quickly as he rose, he appeared to step away from the spotlight that made him famous. Some called it career suicide. Others believed he had simply burned out. But neither explanation tells the whole story. Behind the headlines lies a far more complicated journey, one involving identity, rebellion, impossible expectations, and a decision that changed everything. If you had walked through the streets of Houston, Texas, in the early 2000s, chances are you would have passed right by Mohr without giving him a second glance. He wasn't the stereotypical aspiring supermodel practicing runway walks or chasing casting calls. In fact, fashion wasn't even the plan. Skateboarding, music, and the freedom that came with an alternative lifestyle seemed far more appealing than designer suits and luxury campaigns. But sometimes the fashion industry has a way of finding people who never intended to become part of it. Cole's look was impossible to ignore. Tall and remarkably lean, with messy hair, sharp facial features, and an effortless cool that couldn't be manufactured. He stood out precisely because he didn't appear to be trying. At a time when male modeling was beginning to shift away from polished, perfectly groomed faces, his raw, rebellious appearance felt refreshing. He looked less like someone who belonged on a runway, and more like the lead singer of an underground indie band. That difference became his greatest advantage. Scouts quickly recognized something they believed the industry was craving, a face that told a story before saying a single word. Instead of fitting neatly into fashion's traditional standards, Cole represented a new era where imperfection itself had become desirable. Soon, what started as unexpected attention turned into real opportunities. Editorial shoots led to runway bookings. Runway bookings opened doors to major fashion capitals. Before long, Cole was traveling between New York, Paris, Milan, and London, working with some of the biggest photographers, designers, and luxury labels in the world. For someone who had never carefully planned this path, the rise was astonishingly fast. To outsiders, it looked like the ultimate dream. Magazine editorials showcased his distinctive style. Casting directors wanted the mysterious young American whose unconventional appearance stood out in every lineup. Luxury brands realized that audiences were becoming fascinated with authenticity, or at least what looked like authenticity. The timing couldn't have been better. Fashion was experiencing a cultural shift. The clean-cut, polished image that had dominated previous years was slowly giving way to something rougher, moodier, and more emotionally complex. Designers weren't simply selling clothes anymore. They were selling attitudes, lifestyles, and identities. Cole fit that moment almost perfectly. He wasn't just modeling outfits. He embodied a character people wanted to imitate. His tattoos, relaxed posture, and natural confidence made him seem approachable while remaining intriguingly distant. Fans saw someone who looked genuine rather than manufactured, and that perception became incredibly valuable. Ironically, the less he appeared to chase fame, the more fame seemed to chase him. Soon, industry insiders began describing him as one of the defining faces of his generation. His image appeared in influential fashion publications, and his presence on international runways became increasingly familiar. Every successful season strengthened the belief that Mohr wasn't simply another working model. He was becoming a cultural symbol of modern masculinity. Yet beneath the growing recognition was a subtle contradiction. The very industry celebrating his individuality also depended on turning that individuality into something marketable. Every campaign emphasized his effortless authenticity. But behind each photograph stood creative teams, branding strategies, and commercial goals. His image remained uniquely Cole, yet it was carefully framed to sell products worth thousands of dollars. It raised a question few people asked at the time. Was the fashion world embracing him for who he truly was, or because his personality happened to fit the latest trend? At first, that distinction barely seemed to matter. Success was arriving faster than anyone could have imagined, and opportunities continued multiplying across the globe. But hidden beneath the glamorous headlines was the beginning of a much larger transformation, one that would slowly blur the line between Cole Mohr the person and Cole Mohr the brand. And once that line disappeared, getting it back would prove far more difficult than anyone expected. By the time Cole Mohr had established himself on the world's biggest runways, something subtle, but incredibly important, had begun to change. In the beginning, fashion had embraced him because he looked different. His messy hair, understated confidence, and unmistakable edge felt spontaneous. He represented a generation that rejected polished perfection in favor of something raw and real. But the fashion industry has a habit of turning originality into a formula. Before long, the very qualities that made Cole unique became part of carefully crafted campaigns. Designers wanted the Cole Mohr look. Photographers built entire editorials around his effortlessly rebellious image. Creative directors didn't just hire him to wear clothes. They hired him to embody an attitude. His authenticity had become a product. That's one of the biggest paradoxes in modern fashion. Consumers are constantly told they're buying individuality, yet individuality itself is often packaged, marketed, and sold by billion-dollar brands. Cole wasn't pretending to be someone else, but every photo shoot, runway appearance, and advertising campaign placed another commercial layer over his real personality.
The more natural he appeared, the more valuable he became. Luxury labels understood that audiences were changing. Social media was beginning to influence how people viewed celebrities, and consumers increasingly admired public figures who seemed relatable rather than untouchable. Cole's laid-back demeanor fit perfectly into that cultural shift. He didn't come across as someone desperate for attention, and that made him even more appealing. Ironically, his refusal to look overly polished became one of the industry's most polished marketing strategies. As demand grew, so did expectations. Fashion operates at an unforgiving pace. Every season introduces new collections, new faces, and new trends. Models travel constantly, often flying from one continent to another with little time to rest before the next casting or runway show. Success isn't measured by what happened last year. It's measured by whether you're still in demand today. For someone like Cole, whose appeal depended on feeling authentic and effortlessly cool, maintaining that image came with invisible pressure. Every appearance mattered. Every campaign reinforced a version of himself that millions of people now recognized. And while audiences saw confidence, the industry saw consistency. Brands wanted the same energy that had made him famous. They weren't just investing in his appearance, they were investing in the expectation that he would continue representing a specific lifestyle and aesthetic. That's a difficult burden for anyone, because people evolve, interests change, priorities shift, creative passions grow in unexpected directions. Yet the entertainment and fashion industries often reward consistency over personal growth. When your career depends on remaining recognizable, changing can feel risky. Cole's interests had never been limited to modeling. Long before fashion discovered him, music had been a huge part of his identity. He played in bands, surrounded himself with artists, and gravitated toward creative communities that valued expression over commercial success. Even as his modeling career reached impressive heights, those passions never disappeared. If anything, they became even more important. The more time he spent inside the highly structured world of luxury fashion, the stronger the pull toward creative freedom seemed to become. Music offered something modeling rarely could: ownership. On stage or in the studio, he wasn't interpreting someone else's vision. He was creating his own. That difference would eventually become impossible to ignore. To fans, it may have looked like Cole was living the perfect life, traveling the world, collaborating with iconic brands, and building a career most people could only dream of. But behind the glossy magazine covers, another question was quietly taking shape. What happens when the version of yourself the world celebrates is no longer the version you feel closest to? That question would soon push Cole toward a crossroads that many celebrities face but few openly discuss. And the choices ahead would challenge everything people thought they knew about success. From the outside, Cole Mohr appeared to be living a life most people could only imagine. One week, he was walking runways in Paris. The next, he was shooting campaigns in New York or Milan. His face appeared in prestigious fashion magazines, and he worked alongside some of the industry's most influential designers and photographers. To fans scrolling through glossy editorials, it looked effortless, a non-stop adventure filled with luxury, travel, and success. But fashion has always been an industry where appearances tell only part of the story. Behind every runway show were exhausting schedules, early call times, endless fittings, and international flights that blurred together. Models often spent more time waiting than working. Hours at castings with no guarantee of being selected, constant pressure to maintain their appearance, and the uncertainty of never knowing when the next opportunity might disappear. Even for the most successful faces, stability was never guaranteed. Unlike actors or musicians who could build long-term careers around a recognizable identity, models often existed in a cycle of constant replacement. Every season introduced a fresh wave of talent. Trends shifted rapidly. The face everyone wanted this year could easily be overlooked the next. Cole understood that reality better than anyone. His career had been built on standing out, but staying different in an industry obsessed with novelty is almost impossible. Once a trend becomes mainstream, fashion immediately begins searching for the next one. That created an invisible kind of pressure. It wasn't enough to simply do the job well. You also had to remain culturally relevant, creatively interesting, and visually distinctive, all while allowing photographers, stylists, and brands to reinterpret your image again and again. Over time, that can leave even the strongest personalities questioning where the performance ends and the real person begins. For Cole, another challenge was becoming increasingly clear. Modeling gave him extraordinary opportunities, but it also required him to spend much of his career bringing someone else's vision to life. A photographer imagined the mood. A designer dictated the collection. A stylist selected the look. A creative director shaped the story. Cole's role was to embody those ideas as convincingly as possible. There's immense artistry in modeling, but it also means your own creative voice can become secondary. For someone whose passions extended beyond fashion, especially into music and art, that limitation may have become harder to ignore with time. Outside the spotlight, he continued surrounding himself with musicians, artists, and creative collaborators. Those environments offered something very different from the fashion world. There were no castings, no trend forecasts, and no expectation to fit into someone else's concept of what was fashionable. There was simply the freedom to create. That contrast grew more significant as the years passed. Fans still saw the polished editorials and high-profile campaigns, but they couldn't see the internal balancing act. On one side stood an incredibly successful modeling career that had opened doors around the world. On the other stood a growing desire to pursue creativity on his own terms, even if it meant walking away from opportunities others would never dream of giving up. For many people, leaving that level of success would seem irrational. Why abandon a career at its peak? Why risk financial security, industry recognition, and global visibility for an uncertain future? Those questions would soon define the next chapter of Cole Mohr's life. Because sometimes the hardest decision isn't climbing to the top, it's deciding whether staying there is worth the cost. And when that moment finally arrived, Cole made a choice that stunned much of the fashion world. For years, Cole Mohr had lived the kind of life that many aspiring models spend their entire careers chasing. He had walked for some of the most respected fashion houses in the world. His face had appeared in major editorials. His unconventional look had helped redefine an era of men's fashion. From the outside, There was every reason to believe he would continue climbing even higher. Instead, something unexpected happened. Rather than doubling down on the spotlight, Cole began drifting away from it. It wasn't a dramatic retirement announced with headlines or an emotional farewell to the industry. There was no public feud with designers or explosive controversy that forced him out. Instead, the shift happened gradually. Fans noticed fewer runway appearances. Fashion campaigns became less frequent. His attention seemed to move toward a different kind of creative life. For an industry that thrives on visibility, disappearing quietly can be one of the loudest statements a person can make. Naturally, speculation followed. Some observers assumed his modeling career had simply cooled off as trends evolved. Others believed he had lost interest in fashion altogether. A few even framed the decision as walking away from unimaginable success. But those explanations only scratch the surface. The truth appears to be far more personal. Throughout his career, Cole had never defined himself solely as a model. Long before fashion entered the picture, he had been deeply connected to music, skate culture, and artistic communities that valued expression over image. Modeling became a major chapter of his life, but it was never the entire story. As time passed, those earlier passions began pulling him back. Music, in particular, offered something fashion rarely could: complete creative ownership. Instead of bringing someone else's vision to life, Cole could write, perform, and experiment without fitting into a brand's carefully constructed narrative. Success was no longer measured by bookings, campaigns, or magazine covers, but by whether the work felt honest. That kind of freedom can be incredibly difficult to walk away from once you've experienced it. Of course, choosing authenticity doesn't automatically make life easier. Stepping back from one of the world's most glamorous industries also meant giving up many of the advantages that came with it. The constant media attention faded. New faces replaced the old favorites on runways and magazine covers. Fashion, by its very nature, rarely pauses to look back. For many celebrities, that loss of visibility can feel like losing part of their identity. Yet Cole's path suggested something different. Instead of fighting to remain at the center of public attention, he appeared increasingly comfortable living outside it. His focus shifted toward personal projects, artistic collaborations, and a lifestyle that valued creativity over constant exposure. While he never completely disappeared from fashion, it was no longer the defining force in his life. That decision challenged one of society's biggest assumptions. We're often taught that success means continuously moving upward, earning more recognition, attracting more followers, landing bigger opportunities. Walking away from that momentum is frequently misunderstood as failure. But what if success isn't always about gaining more? What if it's about deciding you've already gained enough? Cole's story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. When someone voluntarily leaves behind the very dream millions of people admire, are they throwing everything away? Or are they finally choosing a life that belongs to them instead of everyone else? By this point, the narrative had completely changed. What once looked like the story of a model fading from relevance now resembled something much more deliberate, a man redefining success on his own terms. But that left one final mystery: that if Cole no longer measured his life by fame, runway shows, or luxury campaigns, then what did he actually gain from walking away? And did it truly outweigh everything he left behind? For years, people looked at Cole Mohr's story through a very simple lens. A young man discovered by fashion, a meteoric rise, international success, then a gradual disappearance from the spotlight. To some, it looked like a career that lost momentum. A model who reached incredible heights, but somehow stepped away before reaching even greater ones. But that interpretation misses the deeper meaning behind his journey. Because Cole Mohr's story was never only about modeling. It was about what happens when a person becomes known around the world for an image that may not fully represent who they are anymore. The fashion industry rewarded him for being different. His individuality became his greatest asset. But once that individuality became a recognizable brand, maintaining it became its own kind of responsibility. The world loved the idea of Cole Mohr, the rebellious, effortless, authentic figure who seemed untouched by the rules of fashion. But behind that image was a real person who continued changing, growing, and searching for new ways to express himself. And that may be the biggest conflict of fame. People often fall in love with a version of someone that exists at a specific moment in time. Fans want their favorite celebrities to stay familiar, but human beings naturally evolve. The person audiences discover is rarely the same person years later. Cole's decision to move away from traditional modeling wasn't necessarily a rejection of his past. Instead, it appeared to be an attempt to make space for the parts of himself that couldn't fit inside a single image. Music, creativity, and personal freedom became more important than maintaining a public identity built around being effortlessly cool. In a strange way, the thing that made him successful may have also been the thing he needed to escape. Because when authenticity becomes your product, proving that you're authentic becomes impossible. Every choice gets analyzed. Every change gets questioned. Even rebellion can become something carefully packaged and sold. Cole's journey highlights a reality many people in entertainment eventually face. Fame can give you opportunities, but it can also create expectations that follow you everywhere. So did he lose everything? From one perspective, maybe. He walked away from a level of visibility most people spend their entire lives trying to achieve. He stepped away from an industry that had given him access to global recognition and unforgettable experiences. But from another perspective, he may have gained something far more difficult to find: control, the ability to decide what his life represented, the freedom to create without asking whether something would increase his fame, the chance to exist as a person rather than constantly perform as a brand. And perhaps that is the real lesson behind Mohr's story. Sometimes losing the version of success that everyone else admires is the only way to discover what success actually means to you. Because the biggest surprise isn't that Mohr left fashion. The biggest surprise is that maybe fashion was never the final destination. But there is still one question that remains unanswered. After giving up the spotlight, the fame, and the identity that made him famous, did Mohr truly find the authenticity he was searching for? Or did leaving the world behind create a new struggle no one saw coming? The final reveal uncovers what his transformation really meant, and why his decision may have been misunderstood all along.